There is a sound a rib makes when it breaks away from the spine. Not the sharp crack of a twig underfoot, but something deeper, a wet tearing, like green wood splitting in slow motion, fibers refusing to separate cleanly. I heard that sound 8 times in the courtyard at York, each crack measuring out the seconds of a king's death. The March wind carried the smell of it to where I stood, chained among the other thralls, iron and waste and something sweeter, more terrible, like meat left too long in summer sun. They made us watch. The Danes always made us watch. They called what they did to King Ælla justice. God knows what name the devil uses for it. I know only that I stood close enough to see his face when they began, close enough to watch the recognition dawn in his eyes that this would not be a warrior's death, swift and clean. This would be something else entirely, something older, something the priests had no words for in their Latin prayers. I was there when it happened. I stood in that courtyard among 24 other Saxon slaves, my wrists raw from iron manacles, my tongue thick with thirst and terror. My name is Oswald, son of Edric, and before the Danes came, I had been a thegn in King Ælla's service, with lands enough to keep 3 families and horses that lesser men envied. Now I was property, worth less than the axe that had taken my freedom, forced to bear witness as the boneless one carved an eagle into the back of the man I had sworn to serve. I thought I understood what defeat meant. I thought I knew what the heathens were capable of. I was wrong about everything. But to understand how we came to that blood-soaked morning, I must go back 2 years, to when the dragon ships first appeared on our shores, and we still believed ourselves strong enough to turn them away. It was autumn when the Great Heathen Army landed in East Anglia in the year of our Lord 865, and the news reached York like a cold wind before winter. I remember the day the messenger arrived, his horse lathered and stumbling, the man himself barely able to stand when he was brought before King Ælla in the great hall. The harvest had been good that year. We had grown fat on our plenty, on the illusion of peace. "How many ships?" King Ælla asked, his voice carrying that particular arrogance that comes from never having truly been tested. He was not old, perhaps 40 winters, with the build of a man who still trained with sword and spear, but whose body had begun to thicken around the middle. His beard was more grey than gold now, braided in the old style, and his eyes held the hard certainty of someone who had taken a throne and held it against rivals. The messenger's voice shook. "They say more than 200, my lord, beached at Thetford. The East Anglians have given them horses." A murmur ran through the hall like wind through barley. Horses. The word changed everything. Danes on foot were dangerous enough. We had fought off raiders for generations, beaten them back to their ships with our superior numbers and knowledge of the land. But mounted Danes could move like we never could, strike and vanish before levies could be raised. "King Edmund is a fool," Ælla said, and the thanes around him laughed, myself among them. How easily we laughed in those days, how certain we were of our own strength. Let the East Anglians deal with their own mistakes. Northumbria has walls. We have the old Roman fortifications at York. Let the heathens come north. We will break them against our stones. I believed him. God help me. I believed every word. I had fought in the border wars against the Picts, had bloodied my spear and thought myself a warrior. What did I know of the Danes? Only stories, tales told by traders of savage men who worshipped demons and knew nothing of mercy. I had never seen what they could do, never watched them move through a shield wall like wolves through sheep, never smelled the smoke of a burned village or heard the screams of women dragged to the ships. I was young enough, barely past my 25th year, to think courage and iron would be enough. The winter passed. We heard reports from the south. The Danes had stayed at Thetford, taking tribute from Edmund, resting and gathering strength. Ælla called his council and made plans. Strengthen the garrison at York. Call up the feared come spring if needed. Repair the walls where they had crumbled. All the proper preparations, all the right orders. He never thought they would move so fast. None of us did. The Danes came north in the autumn of 866, and they did not come like raiders. They came like conquerors, a host so vast it took hours to pass any given point on the road. We received word that they had crossed into Northumbrian territory on the first day of November, and by nightfall of that same day, they were at the gates of York. I was not in the city when they struck. I was at my estate, 3 miles north along the Ouse, overseeing the last of the threshing. The smoke rose black against the grey November sky, and even at that distance, I could hear the screams. By the time I reached York with my household men, 7 warriors, boys mostly, armed with hunting spears and old swords, the gates were already broken, and the Danes were inside. I have tried many times to explain what I saw that day to those who were not there, and the words always fail. Imagine every nightmare you have ever had about invasion made flesh. Imagine a city of 5,000 souls becoming an abattoir in the span of an afternoon. The streets ran with blood, not the poetry of it, but the awful reality. Rivulets of red finding the old Roman drains, pooling in every low place until the city smelled like a butcher's yard on slaughter day. We never stood a chance. The Danes had timed their assault perfectly, striking during the civil war between Ælla and Oswald, when the city garrison was divided and weak. Half the thanes supported Oswald's claim to the throne he had lost. Half supported Ælla, the usurper who had taken it. When the Danes came, we were facing each other instead of the walls. I fought in those streets. I killed 2 men, I think. It is hard to be certain in that chaos, when everything is blood and shit and terror. I remember the weight of my sword in my hand, the shock of impact when blade met shield, the grunting animal sounds men make when they fight for their lives. I remember slipping in something wet and looking down to see a boy I had known, Cuthbert the brewer's son, staring at the sky with his entrails in his hands, still breathing, making a high keening sound like a wounded dog. I remember the Danes, tall and terrible in their mail, moving through us like we were children. They did not rage or shout. They killed with the efficiency of men who had done this 100 times before, in 100 different cities. Spears punched through shields. Axes split skulls. Arrows fell like black rain from positions on the walls they had taken in the first rush. I lost my sword when a Dane kicked my wrist, and the bones snapped like green twigs. I lost my freedom when 3 of them surrounded me, laughing, and one struck me across the back of the head with the flat of his blade. I woke in darkness, my hands bound, my mouth full of blood from where I had bitten my tongue. Around me, I could hear weeping, praying, the small sounds of broken men trying to understand their new reality. We were property now, thralls. The Danes had won York in an afternoon, and they had done it almost without effort. In the days that followed, as we were marched out to the Danish camp on the Tyne and set to work hauling water and digging latrines and doing all the degrading labor that slaves do, I learned the shape of our defeat. King Ælla had fled the city, escaping north with what remained of his household guard. Oswald had fled as well, taking his loyal thanes into hiding. The Danes held York, and they had done what no enemy had managed in 300 years. They had taken the heart of Northumbria, and they showed no sign of leaving. I learned their language, as slaves must, the words for hurry and work and be silent. I learned to keep my eyes down when the warriors passed, learned which guards would beat you for sport and which would simply beat you for cause. I learned that the leader of the Great Army was called Ivar, though whether this was his true name or a title I never discovered. They called him the Boneless, and there were 100 theories about why. Some said he was impotent, others that his legs were twisted, still others that he was so flexible in battle he seemed to have no skeleton at all. What I saw was a man of perhaps 30 years, dark-haired and lean, who commanded from a shield-borne platform because he could not walk. His mind was sharp as any blade I have ever known. He spoke our language better than half the Saxons I knew, and when he gave orders, men jumped to obey with a terror that had nothing to do with his physical strength. He frightened me more than any of the others, and I could not say why. Perhaps because his eyes held no rage, no passion at all, only a cold calculation that suggested he saw people as pieces on a game board, to be moved or removed as strategy dictated. I was one of perhaps 200 Saxon slaves in the Danish camp that winter. They worked us hard, but not to death. They needed laborers, and dead slaves provided no value. We cut wood for their fires and hauled stones to repair the walls of York, and mucked out the horse lines until our backs screamed and our hands bled. At night we were chained in long rows in wooden shelters that let in the rain and wind, given thin gruel and hard bread, and left to contemplate our fall from grace. Some of the men went mad. Some tried to escape and were hunted down and killed in ways meant to discourage the rest of us from similar thoughts. Most simply endured day after day, becoming animals who knew only work and pain and the small mercy of sleep. I survived by remembering I was Oswald, son of Edric, a thegn of Northumbria. I survived by telling myself that this was temporary, that Ælla and Osbert would raise armies, that the other kingdoms would come to our aid, that God had not abandoned us entirely. I survived by lying to myself with every breath. Winter passed into early spring, and we began to hear whispers that something was changing. The Danish leaders held long councils. Scouts came and went. Weapons were sharpened. The warriors who had grown lazy over the winter began drilling again, and the camp took on the purposeful energy that precedes battle. Then, on a cold morning in March, the word spread through the slave lines like fire through dry grass. Ælla and Osbert had united their forces. The two kings who had been enemies had put aside their feud and raised every able man in Northumbria. They were marching on York to take back what the Danes had stolen. An army of Saxons, thousands strong, was coming to save us. I felt hope for the first time in months, a painful blossoming in my chest that made me want to weep. The Danes seemed unconcerned. They prepared their defenses with the same methodical efficiency they brought to everything, strengthening the walls, positioning archers, laying traps in the approaches to the city. Ivar had himself carried to the ramparts each day, studying the ground beyond the walls, giving orders in his quiet voice that carried absolute authority. I was part of the crew, assigned to haul stones to repair a section of wall that had partially collapsed, and from that vantage I could see the Saxon army when it arrived. They came on the 21st day of March, a host that seemed to cover the earth, banners flying, mail glinting in the weak spring sun. I saw Ælla's standard, the red boar of Northumbria, and beside it the black raven of Osbert. My king had come. Tears ran down my face, and I did not care who saw them. The Saxon army made camp beyond bowshot and settled in, clearly planning a siege. For 2 days, nothing happened. We slaves worked and watched and prayed. The Danes seemed content to wait, though I noticed they were making preparations inside the city, moving supplies, repositioning warriors, doing things I did not understand, but which filled me with a creeping dread. On the 3rd day, the Saxon army attacked. They came at dawn, a great rush of men with ladders and rams, screaming war cries that made my heart soar and break at the same time. The Danes met them at the walls with arrows and stones and boiling water, and men died by the dozens, by the hundreds, falling from ladders or crushed beneath rams or simply shot down as they ran across the open ground. But there were so many Saxons, wave after wave, and the Danes were few by comparison. The walls began to buckle. A section near the east gate collapsed under the weight of men climbing it. I saw Saxon warriors pour through the breach, saw the Danish line waver and begin to fall back. For one shining moment, I thought we had won. The Danes retreated into the city streets, and the Saxons followed, cheering, breaking formation in their eagerness to slaughter the enemy who had humiliated them. And that was when the Danes sprang their trap. The narrow streets of York became killing grounds. The Danes had prepared positions on rooftops, in alleyways, behind barricades made from overturned carts and torn-up paving stones. They had archers in the upper windows of every building. They had blocked certain streets entirely, funneling the Saxons into predetermined kill zones. The victorious charge became a slaughter. I watched it from where I stood, chained in the courtyard near the Great Hall, forced to bear witness as my countrymen died by the hundreds in the trap Ivar had laid. I saw them caught in narrow alleys where their numbers meant nothing, shot down from above, crushed together so tightly they could not raise their shields. I saw the Danish warriors, outnumbered 10 to 1, cutting through them with the easy efficiency of farmers reaping wheat. And I saw the moment when King Ælla and King Oswald, leading from the front as Saxon kings must, became separated from their bodyguards and surrounded. The Danes did not kill them quickly. I watched Oswald go down under a spear thrust through the neck, his blood fountaining bright red against the mud-stained stones. I watched Ælla fight like a demon, his sword red to the hilt, taking 3 Danes with him before they bore him to the ground beneath their shields. I watched them drag him, still living, still struggling, back toward the great hall where Ivar waited on his platform. The Saxons broke. The army that had seemed so mighty in the morning fled in the afternoon, streaming out through the gates, throwing down weapons and shields in their panic to escape. The Danes let them go, content with their victory, already turning to the business of stripping the dead and securing prisoners. I stood in my chains and watched them bring King Ælla before Ivar the Boneless, and I knew with a certainty that lived in my bones that something terrible was about to begin. They threw Ælla to his knees in the mud before Ivar's platform, his hands bound behind him with rope, his face bloody from the beating he had taken. 3 Danish warriors stood around him with spears, but the king did not struggle. He knelt in the march mud and lifted his head to stare at his captor, with eyes that held no fear, only a kind of weary defiance that I recognized from 100 council meetings. He had gambled everything on this battle and lost, and now he would face the consequences as a king should. Ivar looked down at him for a long moment, his dark eyes unreadable. When he spoke, it was in Saxon, and his voice carried clearly across the courtyard where we slaves stood watching. "Do you know who I am?" Ælla spat blood. "You are the bastard who stole my city. I am Ivar, son of Ragnar Lothbrok, whom you murdered." The words fell like stones into still water, and I felt something cold settle into my stomach. I had heard the story, of course. All of Northumbria had heard it. Years ago, before Ælla took the throne, a Danish raider called Ragnar had been captured on our shores. Some said he was a great jarl, others that he was little more than a pirate grown old and careless. Ælla, in those days still fighting for power, had ordered him thrown into a pit of vipers, a death meant to send a message to other would-be raiders. The man had died screaming, they said, cursing Ælla with his last breath, prophesying that his sons would come for vengeance. I had thought it legend, the kind of story jarls told to make themselves seem more fearsome. Looking at Ivar's face, I realized it was no legend at all. "Your father died a raider's death," Ælla said, and his voice did not shake. "I would do the same again." "I know," Ivar said softly. "That is why you will die a very different kind of death." He said something in Danish to the warriors around him, and they laughed, a sound that raised the hairs on the back of my neck. Then he turned to look at us slaves, his eyes moving across our faces, and when they reached me, I felt the full weight of his attention, like a physical thing. "You," he said, pointing at me, "you are Thane-born. I can see it in how you stand. Come here." 2 Danish guards unlocked my manacles and dragged me forward. My legs barely held me. I had not been unchained in weeks except to work, and my muscles had forgotten how to move freely. They threw me down next to Ælla, and I found myself kneeling in the mud beside my king, close enough to smell the blood on him, the fear sweat that he would never admit to feeling. "Tell me your name," Ivar said. "Oswald, son of Edric, Lord." The last word tasted like ash, but slaves learn quickly what words will keep them alive. "And you served this man?" "I did, Lord. I was sworn to him." Ivar smiled. It was not a kind expression. "Then you will bear witness to what happens when men kill the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok. You will watch, and you will remember. And if you live long enough to grow old, you will tell this story to your children's children. Do you understand?" I understood nothing, except that I wanted very badly to be anywhere else. But I nodded. "Yes, Lord." "Good. Chain him where he can see everything. I want him close. They chained me to an iron ring set into the courtyard stones, close enough to Ivar's platform that I could have reached it in 3 steps if my legs had been free. Other slaves were brought and chained in a semicircle around what I realized with growing horror was meant to be a theater. We were the audience. Whatever was about to happen, the Danes wanted witnesses, wanted us to see and remember and carry the tale. The afternoon wore on. The Danes brought food and ale, making a feast of their victory, while Ælla knelt in the mud and we slaves watched in growing dread. I saw Halfdan, another of Ragnar's sons if the stories were true, a huge man with yellow hair and arms like tree trunks. I saw Uber, quieter than his brothers, his eyes cold as winter ice. They sat with Ivar and drank and spoke in Danish, occasionally glancing at Ælla, and the looks they gave him made me want to vomit. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, they brought out a wooden frame. It was perhaps 7 feet tall and 5 feet wide, made of stout oak beams lashed together with rope, and when they set it upright in the center of the courtyard, I understood its purpose. It was meant to hold a man spread-eagled, arms and legs extended, belly exposed to the sky. They were going to crucify him, I thought. It would be a horrible death, but a comprehensible one. Christians had been dying on crosses for 800 years. I could understand that. I was wrong. They stripped Ælla to the waist and bound him to the frame, but facing forward, his back exposed to the crowd. His arms were stretched wide and tied at the wrists, his legs spread and bound at the ankles. He could not move except to turn his head, and when he craned around to look at Ivar, I saw no fear in his eyes, only rage. "Is this how the sons of Ragnar take their vengeance?" he shouted. "Like cowards, give me a sword and face me as a man." Ivar said nothing. He made a gesture, and a Dane came forward carrying something wrapped in cloth. When he unwrapped it, I saw an axe, not a battle axe, but a smaller weapon, the kind used for woodwork, its edge honed to a razor sharpness that caught the failing light. "Do you know the Blood Eagle?" Ivar asked, his voice conversational, as if he were discussing the weather. "The old sacrifice to Odin, the way my grandfather's grandfather sent warriors to Valhalla. It is a death reserved for kings and jarls, for men of great courage or great treachery. You should feel honored." Ella's face went white. "You are animals," he whispered. "Perhaps," Ivar said, "but we are animals with long memories. What happened next I will remember until the day I die, and I pray to God that day comes soon, so I need not carry these memories any longer." The Dane with the axe approached Ælla from behind, and the king began to struggle against his bonds, all his earlier courage evaporating as he understood what was coming. 2 more Danes held his head still, forcing him to face forward, to stare at the crowd of slaves who watched with the same horrified fascination as a bird watching a snake. The axeman placed the blade against Ælla's back, just to the left of his spine, below the shoulder blade. He drew it slowly down, cutting through skin and muscle, following the line of the ribs. Blood welled up, dark and thick, running in rivulets down Ælla's sides. The king screamed, a sound that started as defiance and became something more primal, the howl of an animal in a trap. The Dane made another cut, parallel to the first, then began to peel the skin back like a man skinning a deer. I tried to look away and found I could not. One of the guards struck me across the face and grabbed my hair, forcing my head up, making me watch. Around me, the other slaves were weeping, vomiting, some praying in broken voices. The Danes watched in perfect silence, and on his platform, Ivar sat motionless as carved stone. The axeman worked with the precision of a craftsman, cutting through the heavy muscles of Ælla's back in strips, exposing the ribs beneath. Blood ran like water, pooling on the ground below the frame, and the smell of it filled the courtyard. Copper and iron, and the sweeter stench of opened bowels as Ælla's body betrayed him in its agony. He had stopped screaming. Now he made sounds I had never heard from a human throat, high keening whimpers that rose and fell with each breath, when he could manage breath at all. The Dane set down his axe and took up a smaller knife. With this he began to work at the ribs themselves. cutting through the cartilage that connected them to the breastbone, severing each one with careful precision. And then, God help me, I can still hear the sound. He began to break them. One by one, 8 ribs on each side. He snapped them away from the spine with a crack like breaking branches, then pulled them outward and upward, spreading them like wings, like the wings of an eagle. Ælla was still alive. I do not know how. His body should have died from shock, from blood loss, from the sheer impossibility of surviving such trauma. But the Danes knew their work, knew exactly how much a man could endure before death released him. They had kept him conscious through all of it. And now, as the axeman reached into the cavity of his chest, Ælla's eyes rolled back, and he made a sound like air escaping from a punctured bladder. The Dane pulled out his lungs. They came out pink and glistening, still expanding and contracting as Ælla's body fought for air that would not come. And the Dane spread them across the broken ribs, arranging them carefully, making the image complete. A blood eagle, wings of bone and flesh, spread wide as if in flight. Ælla died then, finally, mercifully, his body going slack in its bonds. But they left him there, as the sun set and darkness came, left him hanging on that frame with his lungs draped across his back, a message written in flesh and blood. This is what happens to those who kill the sons of Ragnar. This is the price of making an enemy of the Danes. I knelt in my chains and stared at what had been my king, and something inside me that I had thought unbreakable cracked and splintered. Around me the other slaves wept or prayed or sat in stunned silence. The Danes built up their fires and drank and sang songs in their own tongue, celebrating their victory and their vengeance. Ivar sat on his platform and watched the corpse as if it were a work of art he had commissioned. And when his eyes met mine across the firelit courtyard, I saw in them an emptiness that was worse than any cruelty. He had done this not in rage, but in calculation. This was justice by his measure. This was right action in service of family honor. A man had killed his father, and now that man had paid the price in suffering and death, and the books were balanced. I understood in that moment that I was dealing with a people whose whole conception of the world was different from my own. The priests taught us that vengeance belonged to God, that mercy was the highest virtue, that even our enemies were children of the same Father. The Danes knew nothing of this. Their gods demanded blood. Their honor required vengeance. Their whole understanding of right action was built on a foundation of retribution and strength. You killed my father, so I kill you, and I make your death terrible enough that no one will dare to kill my sons. It was logical. It was monstrous. It was both at once, and I had no framework to comprehend it. They left us chained in the courtyard that night, forced to spend the darkness in the presence of Ælla's corpse. The smell of death grew worse as the hours passed, the sick sweet stench of blood going black and bowels voided in the moment of final agony. Flies came despite the cold, drawn by the scent. Something, a cat or a rat, crept close in the darkness, and I heard wet sounds that I tried not to interpret. I did not sleep. None of us slept. We knelt or sat in our chains and waited for the dawn, each of us alone with our horror and our prayers. Some of the men went mad that night. I heard Osric, who had been a churl from a village near the coast, begin to laugh. A high, broken sound that went on and on until one of the guards clubbed him silent. I heard Wulfstan, an older thegn who had fought in more battles than I had years, weeping like a child and calling for his mother. I heard a dozen men praying, their voices rising and falling in Latin they barely understood, clutching at the remnants of faith like drowning men clutching driftwood. I did not pray. I could not. What words existed that could address what I had witnessed? What God would listen to a slave begging for meaning in meaninglessness? I simply endured, second by second, breath by breath, until the sky began to lighten in the east, and I knew I had survived another night. When the dawn came, they took down Ælla's body and burned it without ceremony, tossing it onto a pyre with the other dead from the battle. They unchained us and set us back to work as if nothing had happened, as if the world had not fundamentally changed. I hauled water and mucked stables and did all the degrading labor of a thrall, and inside, I was hollow, scraped clean of everything I had believed about the world and my place in it. Days passed, weeks. The Danes settled into occupation as if they had always ruled York, and life acquired a terrible normalcy. They installed a puppet king, some Saxon nobleman called Ecgbert, who had bent the knee and sworn to serve them, and the business of governance continued. Taxes were collected, courts were held, the city began to repair itself, and we slaves worked and suffered and slowly forgot we had ever been anything else. I learned more of their language. I learned their customs, their gods, their view of the world. I learned that Ivar and his brothers commanded not just the warriors we had seen, but a vast army that even now was raiding south into Mercia and East Anglia. I learned that they had no intention of leaving, that they saw Britain not as a place to raid, but as a place to settle, to take as their own. I learned that we had not lost a battle. We had lost everything. The years that followed blurred together into a grey succession of seasons, marked only by the changing work. Spring meant ploughing the fields the Danes had claimed, our backs bent under the weight of wooden yokes, our hands blistered around plough handles that we pulled like oxen, because the Danes saved their horses for war. Summer meant endless labour in those same fields, weeding and tending crops that would fill Danish bellies, while we ate gruel and hard bread. Autumn meant harvest, the bitter irony of gathering plenty we would never taste. Winter meant cutting wood until our shoulders screamed, hauling it to warm halls where we were not permitted to enter. I was 30 years old when they killed Ælla. I was 35 when I stopped counting my age, when the passage of time became meaningless except as a measure of endurance. Other slaves died, or were sold away, or simply disappeared. New ones came to replace them. Saxons captured in the continuing wars, Mercians and East Anglians, even a few Danes who had been enslaved for crimes against their own people. We formed no bonds. We learned not to grow attached to faces that might vanish overnight. We became creatures of survival and nothing more. But I remembered. God knows I remembered. Every detail of that March afternoon lived in my mind with a clarity that time could not dull. The sound of breaking ribs, the smell of opened flesh, the sight of Ella's eyes rolling back as they pulled his lungs from his body. I remembered because Ivar had commanded it, because I had been chosen to bear witness, and somewhere in the depths of my slavery, I clung to that purpose. I was not just Oswald the thrall. I was Oswald, who had seen what the Danes were capable of. Oswald, who would remember when others forgot. In the year that I later learned was 872, the puppet king Ecgbert was overthrown. The details were kept from us slaves, but I gathered that he had tried to assert some independence from his Danish masters and had been removed for his presumption. The Danes stopped pretending to rule through a Saxon intermediary. This was their kingdom now, openly and without apology. Halfdan, the yellow-haired giant who had watched his brother Blood Eagle my king, took direct control of York and the surrounding lands. He parceled out estates to his warriors, settled them on land that had belonged to Saxon thanes for generations. Some of those warriors took Saxon wives. Women had no choice in such matters, slave or free. And their children were neither one thing nor the other. Half-breeds who would grow up speaking both languages and belonging fully to neither people. The world I had known was ending, replaced by something new and strange, and I was alive to witness the transformation. By 876, when Halfdan formally divided Northumbria among his followers, I had been a slave for 9 years. I was no longer young. My hands were masses of calluses and old scars, my back permanently bent from years of labor. I had lost teeth to poor food and poorer treatment. I had survived 2 attempts to escape. The first earned me a beating that broke 3 ribs. The second, a branding on my face that marked me as a runner. A hot iron pressed below my left eye until the skin bubbled and smoked. I had become the thing I had sworn I would never be. Broken, obedient, emptied of hope. And yet somewhere deep inside, in a place I barely acknowledged even to myself, a small flame still burned. I was Oswald, son of Edric. I had been a thegn in Northumbria. I had witnessed the death of kings. I had survived. It was not much, but it was something. I was 43 years old, by my best reckoning, when my opportunity came. It came not through any action of my own, but through simple chance, the kind of random occurrence that changes lives for no reason at all. I was hauling stones for the repair of a wall in the eastern quarter of York, part of a chain of slaves passing rocks hand to hand, when the man beside me, a Mercian whose name I had never learned, simply stopped. His eyes rolled back. He made a small sound, almost a sigh, and collapsed. The overseer came running, shouting, thinking the man was malingering. But when he rolled the body over, we saw the foam on the lips, smelled the stench of released bowels, some kind of fit or seizure, the kind that strikes without warning and kills in minutes. The overseer cursed and ordered 2 of us to drag the body away. I was one of the 2 chosen. We pulled the corpse to the area outside the walls where the dead were burned or buried, depending on whether anyone cared enough to pay for proper rites. No one ever did for slaves. We were digging the shallow grave when I noticed that the guard who had accompanied us had wandered off to piss in the bushes. For the first time in 9 years, I was unwatched. I did not think. Thinking would have paralyzed me, filled my head with all the reasons this would fail, all the ways I would be caught and punished. I simply moved. I dropped my shovel and walked away, not running, just walking with the steady pace of a man going about his business. And then I was around a corner and out of sight, and my feet were taking me toward the east gate, toward the road, toward anywhere that was not here. I made it perhaps half a mile before I realized I had no plan, no food, no way to remove the iron collar that marked me as a slave. I was barefoot, dressed in rags, branded on the face. Every Danish settlement between here and the coast would recognize me for what I was. Every Saxon village would turn me in rather than face Danish retribution for harboring a fugitive. I had nowhere to go, but I kept walking anyway, because the alternative was to return to the chains, and something in me had finally broken in a different direction. I would rather die free than live one more day as property. I walked east through country I had once known well, villages where I had collected taxes and settled disputes and been welcomed as a thegn and a king's man. They were different now. Half of them were burned-out shells, never rebuilt after the Danish conquest. The ones that still stood were populated by a mixture of Saxons and Danes, the former defeated and sullen, the latter swaggering with the confidence of conquerors. I stayed off the roads, traveling through fields and forests, stealing food where I could, drinking from streams. At night, I shivered in hedgerows and tried not to think about what would happen when winter came. I made it 3 weeks before they caught me. It was a Danish patrol, 5 warriors on horseback, and they spotted me crossing a field at dawn. I ran. God help me. I ran like I had not run since I was a boy, my lungs burning, my legs pumping, but I was 43 years old and half-starved, and they were mounted. They ran me down in minutes, laughing as they circled me, making sport of it. One of them leaned from his saddle and struck me across the face with the flat of his sword, and I went down into the dirt and did not rise. They dragged me back to York in chains, and I knew what was coming. Runaway slaves were made examples of. They were flogged to death in the market square, or hanged, or subjected to torments that made death seem like mercy. I had seen it done to others. Now it would be done to me, and some part of me was almost grateful. At least it would be over. But when they brought me before the overseer who managed the slave crews, he looked at me with something like recognition. "You are the one Ivar chose," he said in Danish. "The witness." I did not understand why this mattered, but I nodded. "Yes, Lord." He studied me for a long moment, then shook his head. "Ivar Ragnarsson is dead. He died in Ireland 4 years ago, and his wishes died with him. But Halfdan knew you were meant to remember, to carry the tale. He says you have served your purpose. You are no longer useful as a slave." I waited for the sentence. Death, I thought. They will kill me quickly as a mercy for having been Ivar's chosen witness. I was wrong again. "You are to be set free," the overseer said. "Halfdan says a story needs a teller, and a dead man tells nothing. You will go south, to lands the Danes do not yet hold, and you will tell what you saw. You will tell them what happens to those who make war on the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok. Do you understand?" I understood nothing, but I nodded because nodding kept you alive. They removed my collar that afternoon. They gave me a cloak, a pair of shoes, a small bag of bread and dried meat. They escorted me to the south gate of York and pushed me through it, and I stood on the far side of the walls, free for the first time in nearly a decade, and had no idea what to do with that freedom. I wandered south for weeks, staying to the roads now because I had no reason to hide. I was no longer property. The brand on my face marked me as something else, a survivor, a witness, a warning. People shrank from me when they saw it, but they did not try to capture me. Slaves with fresh brands were runaways. Slaves with old scars that had healed white and smooth were something else. Men who had been freed, or had bought their freedom, or had escaped so long ago that pursuing them was pointless. I did not correct their assumptions. I walked until I reached Mercia, until I found a monastery that would take me in, a place where monks who cared more for souls than for politics gave me a bed and food and asked no questions about my past. I stayed there for 7 years, working in their fields, learning my letters late in life, slowly becoming something other than what I had been. And I told my story. God knows I told it. To the monks who would listen, to travelers who passed through, to anyone who would sit still long enough to hear. I told them about the Great Heathen Army and the fall of York. I told them about King Ælla's last stand and the vengeance of Ivar the Boneless. I told them about the Blood Eagle, every terrible detail, until they blanched and crossed themselves, and some refused to believe such things were possible. I told them because I had been commanded to tell them, because Ivar had chosen me as his witness, and even in death his will shaped my actions. I told them because if I did not, the horror would eat me from inside until nothing remained. I told them because it was the only purpose I had left. I am 57 years old now, as best I can reckon. My hair is white, my body bent and broken from years of labor and hardship. I will not live much longer. I can feel death approaching like a familiar friend, and I welcome it. But before I go, I wanted to set down this account in writing, to add my words to the chronicles that the monks keep, so that some record remains of what I witnessed. Because here is the truth that I have learned in the years since York fell. The Danes were not animals, though we called them such. They were men, following the logic of their own beliefs, pursuing vengeance that seemed just by the measure of their gods. Ivar did to Ælla what Ælla had done to Ragnar, killed him in a manner meant to send a message, to establish dominance, to make others fear. The only difference was that we called Ælla's actions justice and Ivar's actions barbarity, because one served our interests and the other did not. I do not forgive what was done. How could I? I can still hear the sound of breaking ribs, still see the eagle wings spread across a dying king's back. These memories will follow me to the grave and beyond, if there is a beyond. But I understand now what I did not understand then, that monsters are made, not born, that every act of violence grows from some earlier seed, that Ælla's pride and Ivar's vengeance were two sides of the same bloodied coin, and we are all, Saxon and Dane alike, trapped in cycles of retribution that none of us know how to break. The kingdom of York, or Jorvik, as the Danes call it now, endures. It is a strange place, neither fully Danish nor fully Saxon, where the two peoples live side by side in an uneasy peace, built on the bones of the conquered and the graves of the conquerors. The Danes who settled there have begun to marry Saxon women, to speak our language as often as their own, to baptize their children in churches built on the ruins of pagan temples. In another generation or two, perhaps, there will be no meaningful difference between them and us. Perhaps that is how these things end, not in victory or defeat, but in a slow blurring of the lines until no one can remember why we were enemies in the first place. Or perhaps I am fooling myself. Perhaps the Blood Eagle and all it represents will echo down through the centuries, passed from father to son, a tale of horror that justifies the next atrocity and the next, until the whole world is nothing but eagles carved in flesh, wings spread wide over the corpses of our enemies? I cannot know. I can only tell what I saw, what I survived, what I was commanded to remember. And so I have told it, this story of kings and slaves, of vengeance and survival, of the March day when I learned that there are worse things than death, and that mercy is not a weakness, but a choice that requires more courage than any battle. I was there when they killed King Ælla. I stood in my chains and watched them carve an eagle into his back. I heard the sounds a man makes when his ribs are broken and his lungs pulled from his chest. I survived to bear witness, and now I have borne it. Let this account stand as my testament. Let it remind those who read it that we are all capable of terrible things when we convince ourselves that vengeance is justice, that our enemies are less than human, that the gods demand blood. Let it serve as a warning of what we become when we forget that mercy and compassion are not weaknesses, but the only things that separate us from the beasts. I am Oswald, son of Edric, formerly a thegn of Northumbria, formerly a slave of the Danes, now a dying man at the monastery of Lindsey in the kingdom of Mercia. I was there, I saw it all, and I have told you true. May God have mercy on us all, for we have shown precious little mercy to one another.